Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1895. Snow falls softly over the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, turning the ridgelines into ghosts. The air is sharp, quiet, ancient, and behind massive iron gates, far from the loud, glittering world of New York society, something impossible has just been finished. House. But calling Biltmore a house is like calling the ocean a puddle. 250 rooms. Let that number sit in your chest for a second. For comparison, the White House has 132 rooms. Biltmore had nearly twice as many, built not for a nation, but for one man's private dream. This wasn't normal wealth. This was architectural domination. 178,926 square feet of living space, over 4 acres under one roof, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, an indoor swimming pool holding 70,000 gallons of heated water, a bowling alley, a gym, a library built to hold 10,000 books. And here's the twist that makes it feel almost unreal. Biltmore wasn't built in New York, where mansions competed like trophies. It wasn't built in Newport, where the rich built summer cottages that looked like palaces. No. This giant French chateau was built in the mountains of North Carolina, in what was basically wilderness, hours from the nearest major city, surrounded by mist, forests, and silence. To build it, they needed more than money. They needed an entire machine. Construction took 6 years and demanded over 1,000 workers. Craftsmen were pulled from across Europe, Italy, France, England, because the kind of work being demanded wasn't common in America yet. Stone, marble, oak, tile, the materials came from across oceans and across states, and the cost. $6 million in the 1890s. Today, that becomes hundreds of millions. Enough to build colleges. Enough to fund towns. Enough to change thousands of lives. But one man chose to build a single thing, a home, so massive it would outlive the world that created it. And somehow it did. Because here's what makes Biltmore different from almost every other Gilded Age mansion. Most of them vanished. Demolished. Donated. Abandoned. Turned into museums. Broken apart by taxes and time. But Biltmore, it survived. And not just as a relic. It survived in family hands, through wars, depressions, and the slow death of the servant. Powered world that made estates like this possible. So the real question isn't, how big is it? The real question is, why would anyone build something this absurdly large here? And how did it stay alive when history erased almost everything like it? To answer that, we need to understand the man behind it. Not the loudest Vanderbilt. Not the most ruthless. Not the one chasing headlines. But the quiet one. The one who didn't want to conquer industries. He wanted to conquer something harder. Time. George Vanderbilt was born into American royalty on November 14, 1862, a Vanderbilt by blood, a billionaire by inheritance. And yet, he was the one Vanderbilt most people didn't notice. If you saw him at a society party, you might have mistaken him for a guest who came with someone else. Because George wasn't built like his brothers. While the Vanderbilt name thundered through America like a train, railroads, banks, newspapers, power, George moved like a shadow. Quiet, private, almost allergic to attention. His older brothers, Cornelius and William, lived for influence and business. Their wives battled in ballrooms like queens at war, turning social seasons into competitions. George preferred something else. Silence. Libraries. Old books with cracked leather spines. Long hours alone. And in the Gilded Age, that made him strange. Society columnists called him peculiar. His siblings called him wasted potential. And his grandfather, the legendary Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, would have called him something harsher. Because the Commodore didn't build the Vanderbilt empire with poetry and paintings. He built it with ruthless efficiency. When George was just 15, the Commodore died and left behind a fortune so enormous, it made other robber barons blink. Over 100 million at the time, money so big it becomes hard to translate. The sort of wealth that can bend laws, buy politicians, reshape cities, crush competitors without even getting your hands dirty. That's what George inherited. And instead of using it like a weapon, he used it like a key. While his brothers expanded the family's railroad empire, George did something that looked almost offensive to the Vanderbilt mindset. He became educated. Truly educated, not educated. Like rich men bragging about their private tutors. Real education. The kind that changes the way you see the world. By his 20s, George spoke 8 languages fluently. Not just a few phrases fluently. French, German, Italian, and more. He could read ancient Greek. He studied art history, architecture, agriculture, forestry, literature, European culture, and he didn't learn it from a distance. He lived it. He spent extended time in Europe, not as a tourist collecting souvenirs, but as a student, soaking in the bones of older civilizations. He walked through cathedrals and palaces with the hunger of someone trying to understand how beauty survives centuries. His private library eventually grew to over 23,000 volumes. And here's what made that library different from the Gilded Age. Look at me. Libraries. George actually read the books. He annotated them. In multiple languages. Like a man preparing for something. Because he was. In a family of titans, George was an intellectual. In an age where men measured success by companies controlled, George measured life by what he understood, what he'd seen, what he'd learned. And the more he learned, the more a single idea began to form in his mind. A dangerous idea, a Vanderbilt idea, but twisted into something else. What if America could have an estate that rivaled Europe? Not a copy. Not a cheap imitation with a few French flourishes slapped onto an American mansion. A real estate, an American masterpiece, built with European sophistication, but powered by American ambition and innovation. A place that could hold his books, his art, his mind. A place not meant to impress for one season, but meant to last beyond his lifetime. A legacy. And then, by chance or fate, George found the location. The mountain that changed everything in 1888. George was only 26 when he visited Asheville, North Carolina. At the time, Asheville was becoming known as a health resort. Doctors prescribed the mountain air for lung problems. Wealthy families visited seeking relief, and George's mother, Maria, wasn't well. The family came for her, but George saw something else. Standing on a ridge above the French Broad River, with the Blue Ridge Mountains rising like a wall around him, he felt something he never felt in New York's crowded, competitive society: peace, space, possibility. New York was noisy, constantly judging, constantly watching, but the mountains didn't care who he was. They didn't want his money. They didn't want his name. They were ancient, patient, unimpressed. And George, who had spent his life surrounded by wealth and expectations, fell in love with a place that didn't ask him to perform. But it wasn't just the view. It was the land. Most of the terrain around Asheville had been destroyed by logging and exhausted farming. Forests that stood for thousands of years had been clear-cut. Streams were damaged. soil depleted. By many accounts, it was nearly worthless. An abandoned landscape. George looked at that wasteland and saw something nobody else could see, a blank canvas. So he began to buy. Quietly. Carefully. Not like a robber baron. Not like a man who takes. He dealt fairly with local farmers and landowners. Paid reasonable prices. Enough that people were shocked, because that wasn't how they expected a Vanderbilt to behave. Over several years, George assembled something insane: 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles. A territory bigger than some entire cities. Bigger than many people's imagination. His family thought he'd lost his mind. His brothers were buying railroads and banks. Real power. George was buying dirt in North Carolina. But George knew exactly what he was doing. Because the estate wasn't just about owning land. It was about changing it. The first experiment. Rebuilding a broken world. George wasn't just building a house. He wanted to build an entire functioning world, so he hired a young forester named Gifford Pinchot, a man trained in Europe, obsessed with restoring forests scientifically instead of destroying them. Together, they would replant, restore, manage, heal. They would create one of America's earliest examples of scientific forestry, turning ruined land productive again. And, in the center of that vast estate, on that ridge overlooking the river, George would build his chateau. Not a summer cottage, not a city mansion, a real home, year-round. A home built around knowledge, art, and nature. A home meant to last. Make it French. When the time came to build, George didn't hire just anyone. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America. The man behind America's grandest elite residences. The kind of architect whose work didn't just sit in history, it defined it. When Hunt asked George what style he wanted, George didn't hesitate. A French Renaissance chateau. The kind George had studied in the Loire Valley. Those old European estates that looked like they grew out of the earth itself. And not a small one. He wanted it big enough to hold his library, his art, his guests, and his vision. Hunt was hesitant. The location was remote. The scale was enormous. The logistics looked impossible. But George was determined. And George had something Hunt couldn't argue with. In 1889, construction began. George was 27 years old, unmarried, no children. He was building a 250-room chateau for himself, his books, and a future nobody else could see. His family whispered that he was eccentric, that he was wasting money, that he would die alone in a mountain palace surrounded by leather-bound books and empty rooms. But they didn't understand the real reason George was doing it. George wasn't trying to compete with his brothers. He wasn't trying to win social battles. He wasn't trying to conquer industries. He was trying to build something that outlived the world that made him. A house that could survive when everything else failed. A piece of beauty that time couldn't bulldoze. And that brings us to the next part. Because dreaming is one thing. Building a French chateau in American wilderness, stone by stone, detail by detail, was something else entirely. When construction began in 1889, even the men who believed in George Vanderbilt weren't sure this could be done, because this wasn't just a large house. It was a European chateau, transplanted, stone for stone, into the Appalachian wilderness. When Richard Morris Hunt first stood on that ridge, overlooking the French Broad River, and studied George's plans, he must have felt two emotions at once, awe and dread. Hunt understood immediately what George wanted. Not a romantic American fantasy. Not a vague French-inspired mansion with decorative flourishes. George wanted authenticity. A real French Renaissance chateau, the kind George had studied obsessively during his travels through Europe. The design drew heavily from three Loire Valley masterpieces: Two de Blois chateau de Chenonceau, two de chambered steep slate roofs, ornate dormers, towers that pierced the sky, a limestone facade that looked medieval but precise. But Hunt wasn't copying Europe. He was adapting it. Because this building had to survive American weather, American scale, and American ambition. The central spine of the house would stretch 780 feet long, longer than 2.5 football fields. Just walking from one end to the other would feel like a journey. And then there was the stone. Stone, steel, and obsession. The facade would be built from Indiana limestone, millions of pounds of it. Each block was quarried, cut, numbered, and shipped by rail to Asheville. From there, a special railway line had to be built just to haul materials up the mountain. This wasn't decoration. This was engineering warfare. Every stone had to fit perfectly, because the walls weren't just pretty. They were load-bearing, supporting a structure heavier than most medieval castles. But here's where Biltmore became revolutionary. On the outside, it looked ancient. On the inside, it was decades ahead of its time. George demanded every modern convenience available. In the 1890s, electricity throughout the house, powered by its own generator, central heating via a massive steam system, hot and cold running water in every bathroom, all 43 of them, mechanical refrigeration in the kitchens, fire alarms, an internal intercom system for servants, multiple elevators so guests wouldn't need to climb endless stairs. This was deliberate. George wanted old world beauty without old world suffering. He loved history, but not chamber pots, frozen bedrooms, or candle smoke. Importing genius, American craftsmanship alone couldn't deliver what George demanded. So he did something rare and expensive. He imported talent. Italian stonemasons arrived, men trained on cathedrals and palazzos. They carved the limestone by hand, shaping gargoyles, columns, and ornamental detail with techniques passed down through generations. French artisans created the elaborate plaster ceilings, intricate patterns molded, installed, and painted by hand. English woodworkers carved oak paneling that would last centuries. Spanish tile setters laid floors that could survive armies of guests. These craftsmen lived on the estate, forming a strange international village on the mountain. In many ways, Biltmore became an informal European guild school in America. American workers learned techniques that hadn't existed on this side of the Atlantic before. But the work was brutal. No cranes, no modern power tools, no shortcuts. Everything moved by pulleys, scaffolding, muscle, and precision. Winters slowed the work, but never stopped it. Because George was impatient. And because George was obsessive. If it's not perfect, do it again. The details nearly broke everyone involved. The banquet hall ceiling, 70 feet high, required massive steel trusses strong enough to support the roof. But George refused to let them look modern. They had to be disguised as medieval wooden beams, covered in plaster and carved detail. The library's carved oak ceiling took months of precision work. Every stained glass window was custom designed for its specific location. Even the doorknobs, light fixtures, and floor tiles required approval. George approved everything. Hunt later said working with George was both a dream and a nightmare. A dream, because George had flawless taste, unlimited resources, and genuine architectural understanding. A nightmare, because good enough didn't exist. If something wasn't perfect, it was torn out and redone. Cost was irrelevant. Only quality mattered. The land had to match the house. The building wasn't enough. George wanted the land itself to be as intentional as the architecture. So he hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the mind behind Central Park. Olmsted was skeptical. The land was devastated, logged, eroded, exhausted. But George's vision won him over. They designed a 3-mile approach road, long, winding, carefully planned so the house would reveal itself slowly. Anticipation before impact. Formal gardens near the house, an Italian garden, a walled garden, a shrub garden. Thousands of plants, many imported, were installed. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted designed a working landscape, farms, forests, nurseries. Beauty and utility. Everything had a purpose. The estate was meant to feed itself, support itself, function like the great European estates George admired. 6 years, $6 million. It took 6 years. 6 years of constant construction. 6 years of refinement. 6 years of expense that made even Vanderbilts nervous. By the time the house was finished, George had spent $6 million just on the house. Not the land, not the farms, not the forestry projects. His brothers were horrified. You could buy railroads for that money. You could build banks. You could dominate industries. George spent it on stone, wood, and beauty. Because George wasn't building an empire. He was building something he believed would outlast empires. And on Christmas Eve, 1895, the doors finally opened. A perfect French chateau stood in the North Carolina mountains, more magnificent than anything in Newport, New York, or even Europe itself. But the real shock came next. Because stepping inside Biltmore was something no one was prepared for. Imagine you are a guest arriving at Biltmore on Christmas Eve, 1895. You've traveled by train from New York, then by carriage, winding slowly up the 3-mile approach road designed to heighten anticipation. Bare winter trees frame glimpses of towers and slate roofs. And then, suddenly, the forest opens. There it is. Massive. Impossible. Silent. The limestone facade rises 4 stories above you. Gargoyles watch from the roofline. The entrance tower climbs higher still. You are in North Carolina. Yet your senses insist you've been dropped into the Lawyer Valley. Then, the doors open, and George Vanderbilt makes his first, shocking decision. Not a hall, a garden. You don't enter a formal hall. You step into a winter garden. An indoor jungle beneath a glass ceiling. Natural light floods in from above. Palms and ferns stretch toward the roof. Exotic plants breathe life into stone. A fountain murmurs at the center. Patterned tile floors reflect green and gold. You are inside, yet it feels like outside. It's disorienting, magical, unlike anything in any American home. This is George's philosophy, made physical surprise first, tradition later. The banquet hall, where scale becomes intimidation. From the winter garden, you are led into the banquet hall. And this is where language begins to fail. The room stretches 70 feet long, 42 feet wide, and the ceiling rises 70 feet high, the height of a 7-story building. The walls are draped with 16th-century Flemish tapestries, each worth a fortune. At one end stands a triple fireplace, 3 massive hearths side by side, large enough to step inside. The oak dining table seats 64 people. Above you, what look like medieval wooden beams are actually steel trusses. disguised by carved wood and plaster. Modern engineering, hidden behind ancient illusion. That was George's rule everywhere: use the future to protect the past. The banners hanging overhead aren't decorations. They are real European battle flags, collected during George's travels. Silent witnesses to centuries of war, now hanging in a room meant for peace and conversation. Even the chandeliers play the same trick. They look medieval, forged in iron, but they glow with electric light. With the flip of a switch, the entire hall comes alive, something most Americans in 1895 had never experienced in their own homes. The library, where George truly lived. If the banquet hall was built to impress, the library was built to reveal the real George Vanderbilt, 2 stories high. Floor to ceiling walnut shelves. A painted ceiling depicting mythological scenes. A marble fireplace for winter reading. 10,000 books fill the room, part of George's personal collection, not decorative spines bought to impress visitors. These were working books, first editions, rare manuscripts, volumes in 8 languages. This was not a trophy room. This was a mind made visible. You can imagine George here late at night, fire low, margins filled with notes in French, German, Greek. A man surrounded by wealth who chose instead to surround himself with ideas. Music, leather, and hidden luxury. The music room follows. More tapestries. A pipe organ built directly into the architecture. Furniture arranged for intimate salon evenings. This was a space for culture, not noise. For conversation, not spectacle. The breakfast room displays prints by Albrecht Dürer. The table is set with custom china. Even morning meals are framed by art. Then the billiard room, paneled entirely in Spanish leather, walls embossed, ceilings painted, the air rich and warm. Every room has its own identity, its own mood, its own treasures. No repetition. No shortcuts. The bathrooms that shocked America, and then something that stunned even the wealthiest guests, the bathrooms. 43 of them. Each with hot and cold running water. Porcelain fixtures imported from Europe. Heated towel racks. Tiled walls and floors that would look luxurious even today. Remember, this was 1895. Most Americans were still using outdoor privies. George's guests were bathing in private rooms that rivaled Europe's finest hotels. The basement, that changed everything below the grand rooms. Biltmore reveals its final secret. The indoor swimming pool, heated, lit from beneath the water, surrounded by elaborate tilework like a Roman bath. It holds 70,000 gallons of water. Pure luxury disguised as ancient tradition. A gymnasium, decades before fitness was fashionable. A bowling alley, not a novelty, but a full, professional setup with custom pins and balls. Wine cellars built to hold thousands of bottles at perfect temperature. Gun rooms displaying hundreds of rifles-like artwork, because here, hunting was not sport alone, but ritual. And the kitchens, all 3 of them. Mechanical refrigeration. Gas stoves, hot and cold running water. Storage systems designed for multi-course meals served day after day to dozens of guests. This was not a palace frozen in ceremony. It was a machine, built to live. A house that feels alive as you walk through Biltmore. Something becomes clear. Despite the scale, despite the art, despite the cost, this place isn't cold. The chairs are comfortable. The fireplaces are used daily. The beds are inviting. George did not build a monument to intimidate. He built a home to comfort, inspire, and endure. But none of it, worked on its own. Because stone doesn't cook meals, fireplaces don't clean themselves, and a 250-room house does not run on beauty alone. Hidden behind the walls was something just as massive as the architecture itself. An army, and their story is darker than most people realize. Behind every fairy tale castle is a reality no one photographs. At Biltmore Estate, that reality lived below the stairs. To the guests, the house felt effortless. Fires were always lit. Meals appeared on time. Rooms were immaculate. Silence followed you wherever you walked. That silence was manufactured, because at its peak, Biltmore required around 80 servants, not counting farmhands, foresters, gardeners, and grooms, to function. 80 people, living and working inside the house. Their entire lives organized around keeping 250 rooms alive. This wasn't employment. It was an ecosystem. The invisible hierarchy. At the top stood the house steward, the unseen general manager of the entire operation. He answered only to George Vanderbilt and controlled budgets, logistics, and discipline. Below him were two powerful figures who ruled Biltmore's internal world. The butler, who commanded all male servants and controlled dining service and public rooms. The housekeeper, who ruled over the female staff and maintained cleanliness, linens, and order in every private space they hired. They fired. They enforced protocol. Their authority was absolute. Then came the specialists. Ladies' maids attended female guests, maintaining elaborate dresses, styling hair, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Valets served male guests, laying out clothes, polishing shoes to mirror shine, drawing baths. Footmen carried messages through the house, using the intercom system, answered doors, served meals, and moved silently through rooms filled with priceless objects. Housemaids cleaned endlessly, beds, fireplaces, floors, furniture, walking miles each day through corridors and staircases guests never noticed. Kitchen staff worked in brutal heat. A head chef, chefs, kitchen maids. Dozens of hands preparing multi-course meals, washing mountains of dishes. Resetting the rhythm of the house 3 times a day. Laundry maids labored in the basement, washing linens by hand, lifting wet fabric heavier than stone, surrounded by steam and exhaustion. Outside, gardeners maintained Olmsted's landscapes. Rooms cared for horses and carriages. Farm workers ran dairies, orchards, and fields. Foresters managed thousands of acres under scientific principles. The house never slept. A day that began before dawn, the servants' day started before sunrise. Housemaids rose as early as 5 a.m. to light fireplaces in bedrooms so guests would wake to warmth. Kitchen staff began even earlier, preparing breakfast long before the family stirred. By the time George Vanderbilt came downstairs, the house had already been alive for hours, but he would never see it. That was the rule. Good servants were invisible. They used hidden staircases, narrow service corridors built into the walls so they could move throughout the house unseen. Guests floated through grand spaces while servants slipped through shadows. 2 worlds. Same building. Never meant to touch. Life below the stairs. The servants lived on site, in quarters built into the house. By the standards of the era, conditions were considered good. Each servant had a small private room, a luxury at a time when many servants slept in shared dormitories. They ate in separate dining rooms, sat in separate sitting rooms, lived under strict hierarchy. Higher rank servants didn't socialize with lower rank ones. Male and female staff were kept largely separate. When the family or guests were present, servants did not speak unless spoken to. No eye contact, no opinions, No presence. You existed to serve and to disappear. The work was relentless. A housemaid could walk miles per day, climbing stairs, carrying coal, water, cleaning supplies. Kitchen heat was punishing. Laundry work destroyed backs and hands. 6 days a week. Sunday afternoons off, if nothing was happening, and something was always happening. Prestige, at a price, yet strangely, working at Biltmore carried prestige. You were serving one of the wealthiest families in America, in the largest private home ever built. You learned skills few others possessed. Formal dining service, maintenance of priceless antiques, operation of cutting-edge technology like elevators and electric lighting. A recommendation from Biltmore's butler or housekeeper could secure employment at any great house in America. Some servants spent decades here. They watched George marry. They saw his daughter born. They mourned when he died. Their names rarely appear in history books. But without them, Biltmore would have been nothing but cold stone. That crushed other estates. Maintaining this army was staggeringly expensive. Wages, food, uniforms, housing, heating, endless repairs. This was the quiet killer of Gilded Age estates. Families could afford to build palaces. Few could afford to run them, year after year, decade after decade. Even for a Vanderbilt, the costs were heavy. And George wasn't just spending money on servants. He was pouring money into forests, farms, books, art, guests, and experiments that rarely turned a profit. Biltmore was designed to be self-sufficient. In reality, it consumed money faster than it produced it. Still, in those early years, it felt endless. House parties lasted weeks. Guests arrived and departed like tides. And every one of them experienced perfection, never seeing the hands that made it possible. But that life, of endless service, endless wealth, endless stability, was fragile. Because George was still alone in his giant house, and no matter how magnificent a palace is, it cannot survive forever without heirs. That silence was about to end. And when it did, everything changed. For all its size, for all its servants, for all its guests and celebrations, Biltmore had a problem. It was a bachelor's house. George Vanderbilt lived alone, inside the largest private home in America, surrounded by books, art, forests, and silence. Society noticed. Gossip followed. His family worried. A man could build a palace, but without an heir, even a palace could die. Then, in 1898, everything changed. George fell in love. A meeting in Paris. Her name was Edith Vanderbilt. They met in Paris, a city George loved for its culture and anonymity. Edith was everything George was not, and everything he needed. She was outgoing, socially confident, and deeply experienced in the exact world George found exhausting. A widow at 32, Edith moved through elite circles with ease. Her maiden name, Stuyvesant, tied her to one of New York's oldest families, descendants of the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam. She had pedigree without arrogance, intelligence without pretension. She had already lived a life. Her first husband, much older, had died, leaving her financially secure and socially established. She'd spent years traveling Europe, equally at home in Paris salons, London drawing rooms, and Roman villas. George was 40 when they met, and this was not a strategic marriage, not a social arrangement, not a Vanderbilt transaction. By every account, it was real. For perhaps the first time in his life, George found someone who understood him. Someone who shared his love of art, culture, and history, but who could also navigate society effortlessly when he could not. Someone who could stand between him and the world. A quiet wedding for a quiet man. They married in June 1898, in Paris. No massive society spectacle. No newspaper frenzy. No show. A small, private ceremony. Pure George Vanderbilt. And then they returned to Biltmore as husband and wife. Suddenly, the enormous house changed. Not physically, Biltmore was already complete, but emotionally. Rooms that had echoed with quiet scholarship, now filled with conversation. Social life gained rhythm. The house became warmer, not just heated, but human. Because Edith understood something George never fully had. A palace is not a home unless someone knows how to live in it. Edith takes command. George had built Biltmore like an artist builds a masterpiece, guided by vision, taste, and passion. He trusted others to handle details. Edith didn't trust anyone. She knew estates. She had grown up visiting great houses across Europe and America. She understood servants, logistics, finances, and the unglamorous reality behind elegance. And she saw the danger immediately. Biltmore was bleeding money. The construction costs were staggering, but the operating costs were worse. 80 servants. Endless maintenance. Lavish entertaining. Farms and forestry projects that hadn't yet become profitable. Even a Vanderbilt fortune wasn't infinite. So, Edith began to work. Quietly at first, she renegotiated supplier contracts, streamlined staff roles, improved agricultural efficiency, reduced waste, without reducing dignity or comfort. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would compromise the estate's beauty, just relentless intelligence. Where George created, Edith sustained. And where George dreamed, Edith calculated. Together, they were formidable. A child changes the house forever. Within a year of marriage, Edith became pregnant. On August 22, 1900, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born inside Biltmore. For the first time, the house had an heir. Nurseries that had existed only in theory now had purpose. Laughter echoed where silence once lived. The estate became not just a monument, but a family home. Cornelia's childhood was unlike anything imaginable. 150 rooms. 120, 5,000 acres as a playground. Private tutors. Ponies. Gardens. Forests. But Edith refused to let privilege rot her daughter. Discipline mattered. Education mattered. Responsibility mattered. Cornelia was raised to understand that wealth was not entitlement, it was obligation. For George, these years were the happiest of his life. He had everything he'd wanted: a home of beauty, a library of knowledge, a restored landscape, a wife who understood him. A daughter he adored. Biltmore was finally complete, not in stone, but in spirit. Time, the enemy George couldn't outsmart. George Vanderbilt tried to defeat time with architecture. But time doesn't negotiate. His health, never strong, began to decline. He preferred books to physical exertion. Long hours of study had shaped his mind, but weakened his body. In 1914, while in Washington, D.C., George underwent an emergency appendectomy. It should have been routine. It wasn't. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt W. died on the operating table. He was 51 years old. He had spent 6 years building Biltmore, and had only 16 years to live in it. Edith was suddenly a widow, again. Cornelia was 13, and Edith now faced something no one else in America had ever faced before: maintaining the largest private home in the United States, alone, on the edge of a world about to collapse. The world falls apart. The year George died was the year the world changed. That summer, World War I erupted in Europe. The culture that had inspired Biltmore, the refined, aristocratic world George loved was being shredded by machine guns and artillery. Back in North Carolina, Edith took full control. No more delegation, no more softness. She studied every account, questioned every expense, made decisions that George, gentle and idealistic, never could have made. Staff was reduced gradually. Unused rooms were closed. Heating and maintenance costs were cut. Agricultural output was expanded. Biltmore had to stop being a dream. It had to become a survivor. And Edith understood something brutal. If Biltmore stayed the same, it would die. But to save it, she would have to break every rule of Gilded Age society. And what she did next would shock America. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, Biltmore did not simply lose its owner. It lost its shield. Because the world that had allowed something like Biltmore to exist, the slow, servant-powered, eternal world of the Gilded Age, was about to be ripped apart. And Edith Vanderbilt stood alone in its path, a widow in a world on fire. Edith was 49 years old. Her daughter, Cornelia, was 13, and resting on her shoulders was the largest private home ever built in America. That same year, Europe exploded into World War I. The old aristocratic culture George loved, the salons, the estates, the belief that beauty could last forever, was being erased by trenches, machine guns, and artillery. Back in North Carolina, the effects were quieter, but just as dangerous. Money tightened. Labor became uncertain. Social expectations changed. And Biltmore, built to consume wealth endlessly, was suddenly exposed as fragile. Edith understood something immediately. If she ran Biltmore the way George had, it would not survive. Edith takes absolute control. George had governed Biltmore gently. He trusted managers. He believed in goodwill. Edith believed in numbers. She took direct command of the estate, every ledger, every payroll list, every delivery invoice. Nothing escaped her attention. Servants, once shielded from scrutiny, now answered to a woman who noticed everything. Edith did not rule with cruelty, but she'd ruled with precision. Gradual changes began. Staff numbers were reduced, not brutally, but relentlessly. Rarely used rooms were closed to cut heating and maintenance. Costs. Entertaining was scaled back. Agricultural operations were expanded and modernized. The estate had to produce, not just impress, because beauty without income was a death sentence. Raising an heir in a collapsing world. At the same time, Edith faced another problem. Cornelia, a girl raised inside a palace, attended by servants, insulated from reality, now growing up in a world that no longer worshipped palaces. Edith made a decision that shocked society. Cornelia would leave Biltmore. She would attend school in New York, live with relatives, ride subways, walk crowded streets, experience life beyond servants and stone walls. It was painful. It was controversial. It was necessary. Cornelia needed to understand the real world, because one day, the fantasy might be gone. Biltmore at war. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, even Biltmore could not remain untouched. The estate shifted toward the war effort. Farms increased food production. Fundraisers were held for war bonds. Young male staff enlisted. The era of endless house parties and leisurely wealth suddenly felt obscene. The world was bleeding, and Edith adjusted again. The 1920s. The Gilded Age dies for good. After the war, America did not return to the old ways. The 1920s were fast, loud, urban. Jazz replaced string quartets. Cities replaced estates. The idea of maintaining a 250-room house with dozens of servants now felt embarrassing, even immoral. and the government made sure of it. Income taxes rose. Estate taxes were introduced. Passing down vast fortunes became expensive, sometimes impossible. One by one, the great houses fell. Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue were demolished. Cottages were shuttered or sold. Palaces that had cost millions were suddenly liabilities. Edith watched this happen. She understood the warning. Biltmore was next. Cornelia grows up, and the pressure mounts in 1924. Cornelia married in a lavish ceremony at Biltmore. For a moment, it felt like the old world might continue. But beneath the celebration, pressure was building. Cornelia had her own ideas. Edith was aging. The estate still operated at a loss. And then came the blow that shattered everything. 1929. The collapse, the stock market crash of 1929 didn't just end fortunes. It ended illusions. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Money that once seemed eternal vanished overnight. Even the Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it was, shrunk. And Biltmore, with its endless maintenance costs, became unsustainable in its traditional form. Edith was now 64 years old. She had spent 15 years fighting to preserve George's dream. And now she faced the decision that would define her legacy. The choice that saved everything. Edith could have sold Biltmore. Many expected her to. Other families were doing exactly that, walking away from palaces that had become financial graves. But Edith understood something her critics didn't. Biltmore was not just a house. It was George. It was the place where her daughter was born. The embodiment of a vision meant to last. So Edith did something unthinkable. Something that horrified high society. Something George himself might have struggled to accept, but would have understood. In 1930, Edith Vanderbilt opened Biltmore to paying tourists. For $1, strangers could walk through the ground floor rooms of America's greatest private home. Society gasped. Charging admission was vulgar. Allowing strangers inside your home was humiliating. It violated everything the Gilded Age stood for. Edith didn't care. She wasn't protecting pride. She was protecting survival. And against all expectations, it worked. But opening the doors was only the beginning. Because to truly save Biltmore, Edith would have to give up something George had once believed was untouchable. The land itself. Opening Biltmore to the public in 1930 shocked America, but it did not magically solve everything. It bought time. And time, for Edith Vanderbilt, was the most valuable currency left. Strangers in the palace imagine walking through Biltmore in the early 1930s. The country was breaking apart. Banks were failing. Families were losing homes. Jobs vanished overnight. And for $1, ordinary Americans stepped inside a world they'd only read about in newspapers. They stood beneath the 70-foot ceiling of the banquet hall. They stared at tapestries older than the United States. They walked floors once reserved for presidents and writers. But this wasn't a museum. Edith and Cornelia still lived there. Tourists accessed only the ground floor, while private family life continued above. Sometimes visitors caught glimpses. Edith crossing a corridor, Cornelia passing quietly. Two Americas, briefly overlapping. The income helped, but it wasn't enough. The hardest decision of Al selling the land. Edith knew the truth. The house could survive. The vast estate could not. In 1932, she made the most painful choice of her life. She sold approximately 86 acres of the original estate to the federal government. The land became part of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. It was devastating. George had envisioned a vast, self-sustaining estate, forests, farms, watersheds all working together. That dream was now gone, but there was also poetry in the loss. George had pioneered scientific forestry on that land with Gifford Pinchot. Now, it would be protected forever, preserved for the public, instead of destroyed by speculation or logging. The sale provided desperately needed capital. Biltmore shrank from 125,000 acres to about 8,000. The empire was gone. A heart survived. A palace at war. Just as the estate stabilized, the world shifted again. World War II erupted. Biltmore's remote location and massive, secure rooms made it ideal for something extraordinary. Fearing bomb attacks on Washington, priceless artworks from the National Gallery of Art were secretly transported to Biltmore for safekeeping. For several years, some of the most valuable paintings on Earth were hidden inside George's creation, stored in the music room and other protected spaces. In a strange twist of fate, a private American mansion became a wartime vault for civilization itself. Tourism slowed during the war. Gas was rationed. Travel was restricted. But Edith, now in her 70s, kept going. She had already survived a depression. She would survive a war. A daughter who couldn't stay Cornelia's life began to pull away from Biltmore. Her marriage collapsed in the 1930s. She divorced, traveled, lived abroad, and spent long periods away. The girl raised inside the largest house in America found the responsibility suffocating. She wanted a life not defined by walls and ledgers. It was Edith, the woman who had married into the Vanderbilt dynasty, who stayed, who carried the weight, who made the decisions, who sacrificed the dream so the house could live. The end of A Guardian in 1958, Edith Vanderbilt died at 92. She had outlived George by 44 years. She had spent nearly half a century fighting for something that was never truly hers, but that she loved fiercely. When she died, Biltmore still stood, still owned by the family, still operating, still alive, damaged, diminished, changed, but alive, against every historical precedent, against every economic force that destroyed other Gilded Age estates. Biltmore had survived. The question now, passed to the next generation, could Biltmore adapt again? Or would the modern world finally finish what time, war, and depression had failed to do? Because the mid-20th century brought new threats, taxes, maintenance, modernization, and a world that no longer believed in palaces. And the answer would come from a grandson who understood that survival required reinvention. By the 1960s, Biltmore faced a truth no amount of nostalgia could soften. Survival alone was no longer enough. Even reduced to 8,000 acres, even open to tourists, even stripped of its old, world servant army, the math still didn't work. Taxes rose. Maintenance never stopped. A 250-room house aged like a living creature, always needing care. This was the moment when most great estates finally surrendered, but Biltmore didn't. Because the responsibility passed to a man who understood something Edith had proven and again. You don't save a legacy by freezing it in time. You save it by teaching it how to change. The grandson's steps in management fell to William A. V. Cecil, George Vanderbilt's grandson. He inherited not just a property, but a problem. Tourism alone wasn't enough. Admission fees covered only part of the cost. And with every passing year, preservation became more expensive, not less. So, Cecil made a decision that would define modern Biltmore. The estate needed multiple revenue streams, or it would die. Not reckless commercialization. Not theme, park spectacle. thoughtful expansion, turning beauty into income. The first major move was something George himself might have quietly approved. A winery. Biltmore had always been an agricultural experiment. Turning part of the estate into a working vineyard wasn't a betrayal. It was a continuation. The Biltmore Estate winery grew into one of the most visited wineries in America, producing award-winning wines and drawing visitors who might never have toured the house otherwise. Wine didn't just bring revenue, it brought relevance. Next came hospitality. A luxury hotel built on the estate grounds, not inside the house. This mattered. The integrity of the mansion remained untouched. The inn on Biltmore Estate allowed guests to wake up to the same mountain views George first saw in 1888. 5-star comfort funding preservation. Restaurants followed, gift shops, seasonal festivals, garden events, concerts, weddings, corporate retreats. Biltmore became more than a tour. It became a destination. Preservation without embalming at the same time. Preservation moved into the modern era. Climate control systems were installed to protect artwork and books. Fire suppression systems guarded against disaster. Conservation labs monitored textiles, wood, and paint. The goal was not to modernize the house visually, but to protect it invisibly. Walk through Biltmore today, and the illusion holds. The banquet hall still overwhelms. The library still feels lived in. The winter garden still breathes. But behind the walls, modern systems quietly do what servants once did, protect the house from time. Still a family home. Here's what separates Biltmore from almost every other Gilded Age estate. It is still family owned. George Vanderbilt's descendants continue to live on the estate in private quarters. They are not distant names on plaques. They are involved, present, responsible. This is not a museum run by a board. It is a family business, passed down with all the pressure that implies. Every generation must answer the same question. Do we sell or do we adapt? So far, the answer has always been the same. Adapt. A delicate balance. Modern Biltmore is a financial balancing act. Over 1 million visitors each year. Tourism as the backbone. Winery profits, stabilizing operations. Hotel and events funding maintenance. Careful planning to survive. Estate taxes. Across generations, it isn't easy. Property taxes on a priceless estate are brutal. Maintenance is endless. Labor costs rise. Tourism patterns change. But somehow, the system holds. Not because Biltmore is frozen in 1895, but because it refuses to pretend the world hasn't changed. What George would see today. If George Vanderbilt could walk through Biltmore now, he might be startled. Tourists photographing his rooms. Strangers strolling where silence once ruled. Commerce where privacy once reigned. But he would also recognize something essential. The house is still beautiful. The forest still stands. The craftsmanship still matters. The vision still breathes. His dream didn't survive by resisting time. It survived by learning how to live with it. And that brings us to the final question. What does Biltmore mean, now, 130 years after it rose from the mountains? Is it just America's biggest mansion? Or is it proof that some dreams, if fought for hard enough, can outlive the world that created them? That answer lives in the present. Stand at the entrance of Biltmore today, and you're looking at something that, by every rule of history, should not exist. A fully operational, family-owned Gilded Age estate, more than 130 years old, still standing, still functioning, still alive, almost nothing like it survived. The Vanderbilt mansions of Fifth Avenue gone. The palaces of Newport, donated, shuttered, hollowed into museums. The great estates of America, sold, demolished, or abandoned when money ran out and time caught up. But Biltmore did not follow them. And the reason is not wealth. It's adaptation. The lie that destroys great houses. Most Gilded Age estates died for the same reason. Their owners believed permanence came from refusing to change. They clung to tradition, to privacy, to pride. And when taxes rose, labor vanished, and the world moved forward, they collapsed under their own weight. Biltmore survived because every generation made the same hard choice: change everything, except the core vision. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore to last. Edith Vanderbilt taught it how to survive. The generations after them taught it how to evolve. What Biltmore is today, Biltmore is not just a house. It is an ecosystem. Over 1 million visitors each year, a thriving winery, a luxury hotel, restaurants, gardens, festivals, and events, a preservation operation that runs year-round. Tourism funds maintenance. Hospitality funds restoration. Commerce protects craftsmanship. This isn't selling out. This is survival strategy. Behind the scenes, conservators monitor humidity to protect tapestries. Climate systems guard books, George once read by firelight. Fire suppression protects rooms that cannot be replaced. Nothing flashy. Nothing visible. Just constant defense against time. Still a family legacy. Here's the final miracle. Biltmore is still owned by the family that built it. Not donated. Not sold. Not controlled by the state. George Vanderbilt's descendants still live on the estate in private quarters. They are caretakers, not conquerors. Every generation inherits not just beauty, but responsibility. Estate taxes still loom. Maintenance still never ends. The pressure never disappears. But the house remains. Because they chose stewardship over profit. George would understand. If George Vanderbilt could walk through Biltmore today, he might be shocked by cameras and crowds. He built a private retreat. Now the world walks through it. But he would also recognize the truth. The house is still beautiful. The forest still stands. The craftsmanship still matters. The knowledge still lives in its walls. His library survived. His land, much of it, became protected forever. His vision outlived the robber barons, the railroads, the fortunes that once seemed eternal. George tried to defeat time with stone. Edith defeated it with courage. The generations after them defeated it with adaptability. Why Biltmore still matters. Biltmore isn't just America's largest mansion. It is proof. Proof that beauty can survive capitalism. Proof that legacy requires sacrifice. Proof that permanence is not stubbornness, but intelligence. It survived because people were willing to make painful choices before history made them unavoidable. And that is why, against all odds, it still stands. A French chateau in the North Carolina mountains. A dream that refused to die. A monument not just to wealth, but to will. This was Biltmore. And this was Liturgy of Fear.